28-year-old Annie Nino Hindacha was born in Sweden to Vinod and Nilam. Her family, originally from Uganda, had been compelled to leave in the early 1970s when Ugandan President Idi Amin issued a 90-day ultimatum for all South Asians to depart. The family was granted residency in Sweden and established themselves in Maristad before Annie's birth. Annie had two siblings, a sister named Amy and a brother, Anish. Her father, Vinod, prospered in Sweden by starting a successful business, and the family became well established. Intelligent, ambitious, and confident, Vinod said he knew he spoiled her, but he couldn't help himself. Annie's cousin said she was like the leader of the pack and the glue of the family. After graduating from university, Annie moved to Stockholm to work in marketing for the mobile phone maker Ericsson. As she reached her mid-20s, she was looking to settle down and hoping to find a husband. She adored her sister's children and was keen to start a family of her own. She regularly flew to London and would spend her time shopping, socializing, and making contacts. It wouldn't be long before she met 30-year-old Sriandawani from Bristol. He was well-respected and successful, working in his family's nursing home business, and was already a millionaire before the age of 30. One of Annie's aunts had seen him around and thought the match between he and her niece would be perfect. She arranged for the pair to meet at a coffee shop. Annie's sister said that although Annie didn't seem to like him straight away, after the second date, she had warmed to him. Shireen had similar lives, with parents also fleeing Uganda for the same reason Annie's had. People had differing opinions of. Some said they found him to be quite arrogant, someone that loved to show off his wealth. But others said that beneath all that, he was actually very kind and generous. Annie's sister said that Annie would always talk about how much she liked Shrian's sense of humor and the way he made her feel protected. As the couple entered into a long-distance relationship, taking it in turns to visit each other, they began finding things tough. Friends said they were both very headstrong and often argued, presumably about the distance. At one point, Annie called time on the relationship, but they eventually patched things up with Annie giving up her job in Stockholm and moving into an apartment in Luton so that the couple could be closer. Her parents soon flew over to meet Shirin's family. Vinod recalled feeling a bit intimidated by the wealth of the Duani family, but said they were very welcoming and warm. Vinod said that everyone had really liked Srihan. He was polite, educated, and driven, and the couple seemed to have a great connection. Annie told her dad that Srihan did not believe in sex before marriage, something Vinod said showed dedication to his religion and Annie as his future wife. After the visit was, and both parents had approved of the couple and the families, Annie and Sri and May plans to marry. In October 2010, 100 of guests gathered just outside of Mumbai to celebrate the 3-day wedding of Sri and Duani and Annie Hindocha. It was a truly exquisite event, and Annie had spent 3 months in India planning it. Vinod said that although his family were not wealthy like the Duanis, he had been saving for his children's wedding since they were born and wanted to give Annie everything she had dreamed of. As picture-perfect as the wedding had seemed, some of Annie's close friends recalled feeling weird about it, with one of her friends saying it didn't feel like Annie was very present and someone else referring to the wedding as a strange experience that didn't feel like the friends she knew. The 3-day event would soon be over, and Shreel and Annie Duani would be heading off for their honeymoon. 3 weeks after their gorgeous wedding, the couple headed to South Africa on their 10-day honeymoon. Annie had no idea where they were going, and the whole thing had been planned by Shrian. He had told people he chose South Africa because it was an S for Shrian and an A for Annie. After a busy and eventful few days, they arrived at Cape Town International Airport from Johannesburg on Friday, November 12th. Sheehan was looking to flag down a taxi. Instead of using the hotel's dedicated car service, he opted for the local shuttle service at a cheaper rate. A driver named Zola Tongo pulled over in a Volkswagen minivan, and the couple began the 20-minute drive to their lavish waterfront hotel called Cape Grace. Before Zola dropped the Duanis at their hotel, Srian asked Tongo to wait for him so he could make plans for him to pick them up the following night for dinner. Shreem said he wanted Tongo to show the couple around Cape Town as well, and Tongo agreed to act almost as an unofficial tour guide for the pair. The following day, before the couple were picked up by Tongo, they spent time at the bar having some drinks and taking pictures. Shrian had reserved a table at 96 Winery Road, one of the most acclaimed restaurants in the area. Tongo picked the couple up at about 7:30 p.m. But on the way to the restaurant, Sryan and Annie decided they weren't in the mood for a big meal and wanted something lighter. Tongo said he knew the right area and would take them there. He pulled off the highway just before 9 p.m. and eventually dropped them off at the Surfside restaurant in Strand. They stayed for only a short time. Tongo picked them up at around 10:30 p.m. Shryan said Annie was keen to see the raw and real culture of some parts of South Africa, especially the nightlife of the townships. He said she insisted that Tongo drive around and show them what it was like. The three drove into the township of Ngujulito. To this day, Ngujulito has an extremely high crime rate, and people that live there say it's rare to ever leave your homes after dark, let alone have tourists that visit. Over 700 people were murdered in Ngujulito between 2,052,010, which amounts to one murder every 2.5 days for 5 consecutive years. The police said they themselves wouldn't even travel into some of the townships without being in a big group. At 10:45, Tongo stopped the car at an intersection, and out of nowhere, 2 men rushed the vehicle and started banging on the windows holding guns. The men got into the car, eventually forcing Tongo out. They began driving around for almost an hour with the couple holding each other in the back seat, terrified. They took Sheehan's watch and phone and Annie's jewelry. Eventually, the car stopped. The man who was driving said they didn't want to hurt the couple and they would let them go, but separately. Sherwin was then thrown out onto the road, and the gun-wielding men sped off into the night with a hysterical Annie in the back seat. At 10:30 p.m., a man opened his door to find Sheeran standing in front of him, crying and asking if there was anywhere near he could report a carjacking. He had been stumbling up and down the road, knocking on doors, moving from one home to the next in the dark. The man said he asked him for details, but Sheeran was hazy and too distraught to remember a lot. The police arrived shortly after and took Shreem back to the location it had happened in, driving around trying to piece everything together. They also quickly located the taxi driver Zola Tongo, who had reported the carjacking as well, and everyone headed back to the Cape Grace Hotel together. The hotel manager spoke with both Shryan and Tongo. He commented how odd it was to staying in a hotel as glamorous as the Cape Grace on your honeymoon and be wanting to travel through dangerous townships like Guadalajara in the middle of the night. Shortly after, Vinod got a call off Praikesh back in Bristol, saying that Annie had been kidnapped. Vinod was confident they could pay the kidnappers whatever they wanted and save his daughter. After this, he would then answer the phone again, this time to Sriyan, telling him how sorry he was unable to protect Annie. Vinod booked the first flight out. Early the following morning, police received a call from a resident living in a neighborhood in Khayelitsha, about a 20-minute drive from Ngujulito. They reported that a gray Volkswagen minivan had been sitting alongside the road all night. At 8 a.m., the police got to the vehicle. Lying across the back seat was the body of Annie Doheny. She had been shot once at point-blank range in the neck, and the bullet was lodged in the seat. She had some bruises on her body, and the coroner confirmed that she would have bled to death. Tragically, her father would hear of this as he was boarding his connecting flight from Amsterdam. He said he spent the journey feeling totally numb. He met Shreya the following day at the Cape Grace Hotel. One of the officers that arrived at the scene that morning said he knew right away this would not be a straightforward case. Something felt strange and didn't sit right with him. He said that Tongo would have known the area well enough to know the dangers at least, and probably enough that he would have most likely been able to identify the 2 men. You wouldn't drive tourists around there during the day, let alone at night. So why did you? The officers asked. She insisted, Tongo said. But Annie's sister said she simply didn't believe Annie would have wanted to do that, and was well aware of the potential dangers they could face. The officer questioning Tongo wondered why the men let both he and Shreem leave alive and unharmed, knowing they would likely go straight to the police and identify them. And then they proceed with Annie by herself and she gets shot. That, to me, just doesn't gel, he recalled. The murder of Annie Doheny was shocking, and the residents of Cape Town and South Africa as a whole said despite the crime rates, this was still an appalling and awful case by anyone's standards. Annie's story took up vast amounts of space in the news and had immense media coverage from all over the world. Authorities threw a huge amount of time and resources at the case, keen to solve something that had become such big news so quickly. Zolotongo was initially very helpful with police and was keen to answer their questions. The case was moving at a rapid pace, and the two men that had hijacked the vehicle were quickly located. Prince found in and on the car took police straight to a man named Gallo Mangini. He'd been arrested several years earlier and his prints had remained on file. He was apprehended in his home, and while police were searching around, they found a phone that had been wedged in between the mattress and the bed frame. When they asked who this belonged to, Mangini said it belonged to the taxi driver, Zolotongo. Mengele confessed to his involvement almost immediately. He told police that the third man they were looking for was 26-year-old Zwamodola Quabe. Quabe was found 2 days later, and by this time, Shirin had already flown back to the UK. While Quabe was being questioned, he threw a third and new name into the mix, Mondo Mbalambo, a receptionist at another hotel. As Quabe was leaving one of his interviews, Mond was being brought in. As he passed him, Quabe asked police if he could speak to him, but that he would say it in English. He said, "Tell them everything." Police would soon make another announcement. The 31-year-old taxi driver who had been so helpful and forthcoming with detectives had also been arrested in connection with the murder of Annie Dewani. Zolotongo's friends said it came as a total shock to them. He had no criminal record and had always been so responsible and law-abiding. They said something like this was hard to believe. But Shrien told a reporter he had actually suspected that Tongo was involved. So the arrest didn't come as a complete shock. As the media firestorm raged on, Annie was finally laid to rest. 1,500 people would gather in a concert hall in London for Annie's memorial service, and her ashes would later be scattered in her favorite area of the Vänern Lake, which was close to her hometown in Sweden. The police's investigation continued, and to their surprise, Zolotongo would make a claim so strong and startling that it would turn the investigation completely on its head. Tonga was escorted into the Winburg Magistrates' Court, his face hidden by a sheet. It had been announced that he was likely to enter a plea bargain and receive a more lenient sentence in exchange for more information about the case. Tongo claimed that this was no random attack, and he wanted to tell the whole truth about what had really happened that night. He alleged that it had in fact been Annie's husband, Shrien, that had orchestrated the entire crime and put together the plan to kill his new bride. He said that the day he picked Shrien and Annie up from the airport, Shrien hung back to talk to him while Annie went inside. According to the CCTV, Tongo said to Shirin that he was not the man for the job, but that he knew someone that could facilitate his request. He said that Shirin offered $15,000, the equivalent of less than £1,000 at the time, to carry out the alleged hit. The police said that Tongo's claims appeared to be backed up by the copious amounts of CCTV footage, but others said that the CCTV backed up Shri inside the story and version of events too. Tangio said that after he drove away, he headed to the hotel that Mond worked at, and it was here that Mond contacted Quabe, and the plan was set in motion. Phone records showed Mond repeatedly trying to get hold of Quabe and Tongo. The CCTV in the hotel Mond worked at had audio as well, and during one of the calls he said, "It's that thing we were talking about. It must happen today." Tongo said that he had met Shrien just before noon on the day of the murder so that Shrien could get his money converted. Tongo drove him to the place with a lower conversion rate than the hotel. Vinod said he rang to get hold of Annie, but Shrien answered the phone and said he was in fact at the market changing some money over. Vinod thought nothing of it and just asked that she call him back later. Tongo professed that Shirin took him aside outside the Surfside restaurant on the night of the murder and wanted to know if he had arranged for the guys. Tongo confirmed that everything had been arranged. As they began to drive into Gugler 2, Tongo said that he and Shrien exchanged several text messages. It was alleged that Shrien had told him the cash was in an envelope in a pouch behind the front seat. Police said that the texts and calls between the pair were corroborated by cell phone data analysis, but because Shrien's phone was never, it was a media frenzy, and nobody knew what to think. If this plea deal was to go ahead, it meant that Annie's family had to be consulted, and they were faced with a difficult and gut-wrenching decision. But her family all ultimately agreed for Tongo to accept it, and as confused and devastated as they were, they said they just wanted the truth about what had happened to Annie. The amount of public attention that Annie's case was getting was even more clear to see when the court cases started. The story was huge and getting more surreal by the day. Sheeran and his family vehemently denied all the claims, saying it was completely ridiculous and lacked any evidence at all. Sheeran's lawyers, two of the most powerful and successful in the country, said that it just seemed incomprehensible that he would have asked the first person he met in Cape Town to carry out a hit on his wife, and it just made no sense for the state to be suggesting it. They said the evidence didn't actually prove anything. A little over a month after Annie had been killed, Zola Tongo was jailed for 18 years after making a plea agreement. Mond and Quabe soon followed suit and would both start pointing the finger at Sri and Duani too. Kwame would also be offered a reduced sentence, which he would accept in exchange for a guilty plea and his promise of a testimony against Shryan and any other criminal proceedings related to the crime. He was subsequently jailed for 25 years. Menjini was not offered any kind of deal, and he would later plead not guilty in court. Authorities said there was no point in offering him a plea deal because he couldn't have taken them any further with the case than anyone else involved. Mangani had his trial pushed back as he underwent surgery for a brain tumor, but he was ultimately convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Lawyers for both Quabe and Menjel said their clients had been abused, even tortured by the police because authorities were so pressured to solve such a high-profile case. The police denied all the allegations. Hotel receptionist Mond admitted to his involvement, but he was granted full immunity from prosecution in exchange for his promise of a truthful testimony against Cryan, something which left many shocked, considering he had been the one to make the call to Kwabi and arrange the hit. Monday said, "I want to state it here that Mr. Duani is lying. He knows everything from the beginning to the end." Sherwin would soon find himself arrested in Bristol on suspicion of conspiring to murder Annie, and South African authorities were now fighting to extradite him. But despite what the men were saying, there still didn't appear to be any motive. People said he wouldn't have gained anything from Annie's death financially as there was no life insurance policy. And by all accounts, there didn't appear to be any issues within the couple's relationship. But an interview with the Sun newspaper was later published, which gave the South African police a potential motive if Sheeran was involved. Anonymous emails have been sent to the Sun suggesting that Sheeran was gay, and people alleged that he had been paying a male prostitute for sex. His name was Leopold Leeser and was known to his clients as the German Master. Leopold told the Sun that Shireen had confided, "I just married the girl of my dreams," he said. "Why would I want to kill her?" But police began speculating that perhaps Annie had found out during the honeymoon that Sheeran was keeping this potential secret about his sexuality, and this is what sparked the later events. One of the leading investigators said it had become the most publicized, most in-your-face case he'd seen in his 36 years on the job. Although Vinod fiercely fought back against anyone that suggested his son-in-law may have been involved, he later revealed that over time, things had begun to eat away at him more and more. "I have spoken with my son-in-law, and there are far more questions than answers," he said. Many South African reporters and journalists agreed and said that although the crime rates in the area was high, something just didn't add up. One reporter said that this was not a typical crime, far from it, and a big red flag had been that the car was just left there rather than being burnt or sold on. Vinod said Sryan would often give varying accounts of what happened that night, different times and different orders of events. One example being that Sryan had told authorities Kwabe and Menjini had taken all of Annie's jewelry. But after Annie was found, he phoned an officer to ask him to check his SIM in the back seat of the car. He said he would find Annie's £25,000 engagement ring in there, and sure enough, there it was. When he was asked why this wasn't in his original statement, Shreem said he was in shock at the time, and now he wanted to amend the statement he had made. Sheeran had also thrown a pizza party the night before Annie's funeral, which Vinod said he found to be highly inappropriate and disrespectful. Annie's family recalled that Sheeran was furious that they had gathered to say goodbye to Annie before she was laid to rest, and was very rough with her body when trying to dress her, something Annie's cousin said made her extremely uncomfortable. Her cousin also said the letters and flowers the family had left with Annie's body ended up on the floor when Sheeran grabbed them and threw them down. Sheeran later apologized to the family and admitted he shouldn't have acted in that way. The Dewarney family hired Max Clifford to handle the overwhelming amount of attention from the press. Max Clifford was a well-known London press agent who had represented celebrities such as Muhammad Ali, Marvin Gaye, and Marlon Brando. Once well-respected and sought after in the world of PR, he had a huge fall from grace in 2014. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison after being found of a string of indecent assaults against young girls. He would later die in prison after suffering a heart attack. While he was handling Shryan's case, Shryan's brother, Priyen, demanded that Annie's family sign an agreement that said they would not say anything to the media without consulting Max Clifford first. Vinod refused. Shirin was sent to the Priory Hospital in Bristol and was said to be suffering from depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. Max Clifford said that Shirin had lost 28 pounds since his wife's death and was getting weaker and weaker and weaker. Shortly after, he was detained under the Mental Health Act. Due to his mental health issues, Shirin's extradition hearings were pushed back and put off for a long time, but they finally began at Belmarsh Magistrates Court in London. Annie's uncle said, "We don't understand why Shryan doesn't simply get on a plane and go and tell his side of the story." Annie's brother said, "We are just focusing on this case at the moment, and it is hard to even start making the grieving process final yet because there are so many questions we need answers to." The Home Secretary and later Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Theresa May, signed an order for Shryan to be extradited to South Africa. Shryan entered a plea of not guilty to all 5 charges brought against him, and the trial would be set. On the first day of his trial, the court heard more about his sexuality. And in a written statement read out by his lawyers, Shirin said that despite his previous denials, he was bisexual. Annie's family spoke of their disappointment of not knowing this about him and said they were prepared to sue him for not being honest with them. A list of admissions released by the courts also showed that Shryan had been looking at gay porn and dating websites on the honeymoon and just hours after Annie's body was found. The prosecution said that this, combined with the statements from the German master Leopold and several others, clearly showed that Shryan was conflicted and desperate to hide a big part of his life. They argued that this wasn't about his sexuality per se. Rather, it was about the conversations in which he had disclosed his more witnesses. More witnesses came forward on behalf of the prosecution and said that Shirin and Annie's relationship, no matter how perfect it might have looked, was far from it. Annie's cousin recalled that Annie had spoken to her just after the wedding and expressed her worry about whether a big mistake had been made in marrying him. Annie sent numerous text messages to her cousin saying things like, "Hate him and fighting a lot with Shryan, told him I'm going home. Wish I had never got engaged." A particularly sad one read, "Crying has become my new hobby." Just one day into the honeymoon, Annie sent another message saying, "Really trying. He's a really good guy in all ways, but I don't feel happy with him at all." Others said any disagreements the pair had were totally normal and very trivial, and it's possible the stress of planning such a big wedding had left Annie tired and feeling more emotional. The state star witness was Zola Tongo, and police and prosecution said that the entire case rested on his testimony. He was the only person that could testify to the alleged conspiracy, having been the only one to speak with Shryan. A lot of CCTV footage was shown to the court. One clip showed Tongo and Shriel talking in the hotel lobby just a day after Annie was killed. One of the cleaners could be seen in the frame as well. Shreem talks to the cleaner for a second, and Tongo said that this conversation was Shreem asking him to give the person privacy. After the cleaner leaves, Shreem allegedly asked Tongo if the job had been done. Tongo said he warned Shirin that there was a camera right above them. Shirin looks up and stares at the camera for a second before looking away. Shirin said that this was a totally innocent conversation. More footage was played out. It showed Shirin and Tongo meeting in the hotel again. Shirin, who had been sat with Vinod in one of the rooms, can be seen carrying some sort of white envelope or package. Tongo follows him to another room away from Vinod and other guests and then leaves with the same package. Shreem then returns empty-handed and Tongo leaves the hotel and heads back to his car. The state said they believed this was the money that had been promised for the hit, but Shirin's lawyers said that the money was simply for his services as a driver. Some said this made total sense. Others questioned, if this was the case, why did the exchange of money take place at a private area, off-camera, and away from Annie's father? Tonga was initially very confident on the stand, but when it came time for the defense's cross-examination, his version of events started to change. his story was showing more and more contradictions. At one point, he claimed the police must have added things into his statements without him knowing, which was why he was getting confused. Tongo, Mond, and Quabe were all found to have committed perjury when their testimonies showed differing versions, and they admitted to not telling the truth in parts of their affidavits. This threw everything about the already confusing case into question once more. The defense's case was getting stronger by the day, as the state's case and their star witness began to crumble. On the 23rd day of Sheehan's trial, his lawyers requested that the judge throw out the case on the basis that they deemed it to be massively flawed. This was all before Sheehan had even taken to the stand himself. For years after the murder of Annie Dewaney, Judge Jeanette Traverso gave a statement. She came down hard on the prosecution and criticized their case against Srian. She said that the statements of the key witnesses were full of contradictions and ordered that Sri and Dewaney be found not guilty. Srian said, "It is the evidence of these proven liars that led to a witch hunt against me and the resulting failure to pursue the truth of what happened that night." Annie's family were devastated. They said they felt they had been let down by the justice system and that Annie had been let down too. After Sheehan's exoneration, Annie's family asked for the coroner's court in the UK to reopen the inquest into her death, which would compel to publicly answer questions. Coroner Andrew Walker said there was insufficient cause to start an inquest, and he was prohibited from reaching a conclusion that was inconsistent with the findings of the South African courts. A formal complaint was lodged against Judge Traverso amid allegations of bias, with many feeling that Sheehan should have been made to take the stand and give evidence. She would later be cleared of these claims. Menjini, who was still suffering from a brain tumor, eventually died in prison. Leopold Lasser, the man that had told the papers about his secret relationship with Rehan, was said to have been suffering from tremendous stress due to the court case. Sadly, in 2016, he took his own life. According to news reports, as of 2018, Sheehan was still living in the UK with his boyfriend of about 18 months at the time. In 2021, after serving half his sentence, Zola Tongo was up for parole. Annie's father and uncle went to speak with him in prison before his scheduled release. They said they showed him a picture of Annie, and he was emotionless, unaware of who it was. When they explained who she was, he started crying. Both men said that they weren't satisfied that it was genuine emotion and that he didn't feel remorseful for what he had done, only that he was a very good actor. His parole was then withdrawn a day before his release. The murder of Annie Dewaney is a polarizing case and one that continues to haunt her family. Many think that it was a completely random carjacking that either intentionally or unintentionally ended in murder. Everything that happened in between is purely coincidental, and anything seemingly pointing towards Shryan is unjust, unfair, and lacks evidence. Some think that it was planned, but by Zola Tonga, when he saw the glamorous couple with their expensive luggage and belongings, he saw an opportunity to kidnap Annie and use her as part of an extortion plan that ended up going horribly wrong. But others believe that Shri and Mastermind did the whole operation and got away with an atrocious crime. Annie's family and friends are still seeking answers, and things only get tougher for them the more that time passes. Annie's uncle said, "Still today, we don't know exactly what happened. That brings a lot of uncertainty. Guessing what happened and knowing what happened are two different things. We want to know what happened." The conflicting stories and accounts from so many means the full truth of what happened that night, how it came to be, and what, if any, connection the five men had on that fateful night back in 2010 will likely never be known. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. In 1976, Yoon Sang-ae lived in Seoul, South Korea, with her parents, identical twin sister, and older brother. In June of that year, her grandmother visited them from her countryside home. One day, she took the twins to Namdaemun Market. Unaccustomed to the large city, she lost her sense of direction and became disoriented. In her confusion, she misplaced her two granddaughters. The family, with the help of the police, began an extensive search for the girls. One of the twins, Yoon Sang-hee, was found in Seoul 3 days after she and her sister went missing, but Sang-ae was no longer with her. The family continued searching for her, posting flyers, appearing on television asking for help, and visiting orphanages around Seoul in case she had been found and taken to one of them. All of their efforts failed to locate Sang-ae. The family eventually opened a clothing store in the same market where Sang-ae went missing in hopes she would come back to the area where she was lost. Lee Young-sun, Sang-ae's mother, would look at every child who passed by the store, checking to see if they were her lost daughter. As an adult, Sang-ae's older brother, Yoon Sang-myung, opened a lottery ticket shop, also in the same market. Sang-ae's entire family was distraught over her disappearance, but it took the most serious toll on her father. He withdrew from the rest of his family, barely speaking to his wife, and developed a serious drinking problem as a result of the loss of his daughter. His drinking eventually resulted in him developing severe liver disease, which he died of in 2000. His final words were about his missing daughter. She was the dearest. In 2017, Lee Young-san went to the police to have a sample of her DNA taken in hopes that it would somehow help her find her daughter, whom she still believed was alive even more than 40 years after her disappearance. In 2020, she received a phone call from the police informing her that her DNA matched with a woman living in the United States and that they believed that this woman was Sang-ae, but further testing would be required to confirm her identity. The woman was Denise McCarty of Springfield, Vermont. She'd been adopted from South Korea on Christmas Eve of 1976. Her family had been told by the agency she was adopted through that she had been abandoned at a hospital in the city of Suwon, approximately 20 miles south of Seoul, because she had been sick. Denise visited South Korea in 2016, and during her trip, she submitted a DNA sample as a part of a new government program designed to help adoptees find their birth families. The program had been expanded in January of 2020, allowing adoptees to undergo DNA testing at any South Korean mission around the world, rather than requiring them to travel to South Korea to do so. Denise was able to visit the Consulate General office in Boston to submit her DNA for the additional tests, which confirmed on September 25, 2020 that she was Yoon Sang-hae. Due to the pandemic, Denise was unable to meet with her birth family in person, but she was reunited with her mother, twin sister, and older brother over a video call with the assistance of an interpreter on October 14, 2020, more than 44 years after her disappearance. Denise's grandmother had also passed away since she went missing, but Denise felt as though she, as well as her birth father, were there with the rest of the family for their reunion in spirit. During the call, Yoon Sang-hee told her sister that they all loved her and had never abandoned her. Rather, they had spent every day looking for her. Lee Yong-san showed her the paperwork that still formally lists her as her daughter in Korea. While it is still unclear how she ended up so far away from where she went missing and who brought her to the hospital in Suwon, Denise is happy to have a better understanding of where she came from. Furthermore, as an adoptee, growing up with family members who did not look like her, she was amazed to see her mother and brother, who share a physical resemblance with her, and her identical twin, who looks just like her. She was also shocked to hear her sister speak in a voice that sounds just like hers and learn that their similarities extend even to things like their tastes in colors and foods. I can't describe how happy I am. I feel like dancing all the time. Sleepless nights thick with grief are gone now. I am so happy and I can't wait to see her in person. Lee Young-seon told the Korea Times after her video reunion with Denise. She is grateful to the family that adopted her for raising her so well and looks forward to meeting them one day so that she can thank them in person. Denise feels fortunate to have such a large family that loves her, related to her through both blood and adoption. I've just got this huge family now that loves me and that I love, she told her local news station. You can't be happier than that. You can't ask for more than that. She hopes to be able to reunite with her birth family in person once travel restrictions are lifted, and plans for her adoptive to join her so that both sides of her family can meet each other. Denise is beginning to learn Korean and Sang-hee is learning English in an effort to eliminate the language barrier that currently limits the communication between Denise and her biological family. For now, the family stays in contact through an app that translates their messages to each other for them. 54-year-old Michael Anthony Lynch, who went by Tony, was a married father of 4 young children. In late 2001, he left his home in Magherville, in County Fermanagh, in Northern Ireland, and moved into an apartment in Clones in Western County Monaghan in the Republic of Ireland for work. He was reported missing 2 months later in January of 2002 when he stopped reporting to work. The ensuing investigation found that the last sighting of Tony had occurred on January 6, 2002 on Fermanagh Street in Clones, several days before he was reported missing. When Tony's wife Angela went to the apartment he had been staying in, everything he owned appeared to still be there. It seemed to her that he had run out on a brief errand and simply never returned. Few clues were found in the ensuing years. In April of 2016, a man reported a possible sighting of Tony, believing a hitchhiker he had given a ride to could have been the missing man. However, nothing ever came of this tip. In January of 2020, around the 18th anniversary of Tony's disappearance, authorities announced a renewed effort in the case. Tony's car, a white Mitsubishi Galant, had gone missing with him and had never been located. This led authorities to hypothesize that Tony had ended up in a body of water while driving and had never been found because he and his vehicle could not be seen from the surface. They hoped that advances in drone and sonar technology that had been made in the almost 2 decades since Tony vanished would help locate him and his vehicle. They also made a renewed appeal to the public for information in the case. Because Tony disappeared so close to the border of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, both the Police Service of Northern Ireland and the Gardaí were involved in the search. Civil defense from multiple counties also participated. The new searches began with a 2-week search of 16 lakes and flooded quarries near Clones in early January. No sign of Tony was found. Similar searches throughout the area were planned for throughout the rest of 2020, but they had to be suspended in March due to the pandemic without finding Tony or his car. However, the appeal to the public would ultimately result in answers in Tony's case. On May 18, 2020, a fisherman noticed an anomaly with his sonar equipment while he was out on Upper Lake Erne in County Fermanagh. He believed it was some sort of large, submerged object and was aware that authorities been looking for a submerged vehicle as a part of a missing persons investigation. He notified the Clones Garda station of what he had found. An underwater search was underway by 2 o'clock that afternoon and identified the object as a submerged vehicle. It was pulled from the water, found to be Tony Lynch's Mitsubishi Galant. Human remains were inside of it. DNA would later confirm that they belonged to Tony Lynch. His remains were returned to the Lynch family, and they were finally able to provide him with a proper burial. It was nice once Dad was found again. Then everybody wanted to talk to you about him. And it's great that now there is a grave to go to. I never thought we'd have that. Tony's son Peter said on December 2nd, 2020, Ireland's 8th National Missing Persons Day. Peter also said that his family cannot thank the fisherman who called in what he had seen with his sonar equipment enough, and that they wish that their story and its eventual resolution will inspire hope in other families of people who have gone missing, who do not yet have answers about what became of their loved one. Jerry Hulbert was reported missing on August 4, 2003. It was believed at the time that he had walked from his home in Charleston, West Virginia, to a nearby bus station with plans to visit his son in Cambridge, Ohio, approximately 130 miles north of Charleston. He never arrived there. His family was immediately concerned as the 64-year-old was beginning to suffer from dementia. Little progress was made in the case over the following years despite the best efforts of Jerry's family, whose efforts were largely focused on searching for him in Ohio, where he was believed to traveling. Jerry's case would finally be solved thanks to the efforts of a volunteer 17 years after he went missing. Patty Williams Childress is a retired social worker who now devotes her time to investigating missing persons cases and unidentified remains through various volunteer organizations and websites, including the DNA Doe Project. In the summer of 2020, Who Are You Doe? A Facebook group dedicated to researching cases involving unidentified remains, posted the story of a John Doe found in Kingsport, Tennessee in August of 2003. On August 11th, a woman had been riding her bicycle through Riverfront Park when she noticed something unusual in the Holston River, which police confirmed to be human remains. There was no identification found with them, just a bank envelope in the pocket of the pair of pants found with them containing $267. The remains were too badly decomposed due to their time in the water for them to be useful in their identification on their own. A clay model forensic rendering of the deceased man's face was commissioned to help with his identification. Various leads were followed up on over the ensuing years. A forensic drawing was also created in 2018. However, the man found in the river was still normally Patty limited her research to within a 25-mile radius of where an unidentified person was found, but the bank envelope told her that she would need to expand the immediate area. She found Jerry's case through another site she was active with and informed police in Kingsport of similarities between him and their John Doe. They agreed that the remains could potentially be Jerry's and began investigating this lead. They then spoke with a relative of Jerry's back in West Virginia and obtained a DNA sample from them to compare to the DNA of their John Doe. In early August of 2020, near 17th anniversary of Jerry's disappearance, police announced that DNA testing had confirmed that the remains found in the Holston River belonged to Jerry Holbert. Jerry's daughter, Misty, told WSAZ News that she had been holding on to hope of finding her father alive. She was grateful, however, to finally have answers about what happened to her father. She contacted Patty Williams Childress to personally express the gratitude she and her family feel for the work she did to finally bring resolution to the case. It is not known exactly what brought Jerry to Kingsport, which is in the opposite direction of where he was planning to go in Ohio, but his family believes that he must have gotten onto the wrong bus as a result of his dementia. Police do not believe that foul play is involved in the case. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. On November 18, 2020, the Decatur Police Department in Decatur, Alabama received a phone call that the switchboard couldn't direct. It was eventually transferred to Detective Sean Mukadam of the Violent Crime Unit. The caller's opening words were, "I want to confess to a murder I committed years ago." Detective Mukadam was understandably skeptical of this unsolicited confession, suspecting it might be either a prank or a setup for an ambush since the caller wanted to meet with him. Initially, the caller did little to convince the detective of the confession's authenticity, as he couldn't recall the day or year of the alleged homicide. Detective Mukadam had to consult a chart the department maintained of local homicides committed from the 1980s onward in order to use the other details the caller provided to try to identify the case he was confessing to. He ultimately narrowed down the case to a murder that occurred in 1995. 26-year-old Christopher Alvin Daly had been last seen alive on April 25, 1995, around 3:20 in the afternoon at the Huntsville Hilton Hotel. He worked as a server at the hotel and was there that day to attend an employee meeting. He told an acquaintance that he was going to meet someone in Decatur but did not say their name or why he was going to meet them. Christopher's family reported him missing the following day around 3 p.m., but would later learn that he had been located but not identified an hour before they made their report. 17-year-olds, a boy and a girl, had been out looking for leaves for the girls' leave collection when they found Christopher's body approximately 25 feet off of George Russell Road along what had previously been used as a logging road. He had been shot once in the head. Less than 2 hours later, Christopher's 1983 Toyota Tercel was found partially submerged in the Tennessee River in an industrial park 4 miles away from where his body was found. A rock had been tied to the vehicle's accelerator, and Christopher's wallet and identification were still inside of the car. Police could not establish a motive or identify any suspects in the case despite their best efforts, and the case went cold quickly. It was re-examined several times over the years, but no major breaks came in the case until the phone call in November of 2020. The man who made that call was 53-year-old Johnny Dwight Whited. Whited had a series of arrests on his record for traffic and drug offenses. At the time of the phone call, he was out on bond for felony possession of methamphetamine. He had been 28 at the time of Christopher's murder, and his wife had filed for divorce from him just 8 days before the murder occurred. Less than a month after it, Whited had pleaded guilty to a drug paraphernalia charge. Detective Mukadam was still somewhat skeptical of Whited's confession after the phone call, despite the details he had provided over the phone, but still agreed to meet with him. He and several other members of the police department met with Whited, who gave Detective McAdam directions to the scene where Christopher's car had been put into the river from the back seat of a patrol car. A gate that had not been built in 1995 prevented them from driving all the way to the scene, but Whited was able to show them the last quarter of a mile of the way on foot. In his description of how the vehicle was put into the river, he was able to provide details that Detective McAdam believed only the person who had put the car there and the crime scene technicians who had removed it would have been able to know. During this meeting, Whited also accurately reenacted the crime and provided further details that matched up with the details of the murder. These details were what finally fully convinced Detective McAdam that Whited's confession was genuine. According to Detective McAdam, Whited apologized multiple times for the murder. He seemed embarrassed and as though the murder had been weighing heavily on him. This, of course, does not lessen his responsibility in the crime or change the fact that he remained silent for more than 2 decades. It's not an excuse, Detective McAdam told the Washington Post. He killed somebody. He should have come forward all those years ago. Whitehead finally confessed to the murders after 25 years because he is terminally ill with stage 4 lung cancer and wanted to clear his conscience before he meets his maker. Detective McAdam discussed the motive of the crime with Whited, but could not publicly disclose it, so as to protect the pending legal case against Whited, who has been charged with murder. He was able to say that Christopher and Whited had not met each other prior to the murder. Whitehead was released from the Morgan County Jail on November 29, 2020 after posting $15,000 bail. His court-appointed attorney, Griff Belzer, believes that the bail amount, low for the serious nature of the Class A felony he has been charged with, was approved by a judge because of his client's ties to the community and his declining health. A preliminary hearing has not yet been set and Whited's lawyer is unsure if Whited will want him to file for one. It's a strange set of facts and circumstances surrounding this case, Griff Belzer said after his client's release. Even though he has confessed, I am going to defend him like I would any other client in a murder case. He is innocent until proven guilty. Christopher Daly's surviving family members were made aware of Whited's confession and arrest. They had been losing faith that the case would ever be solved and are grateful and relieved to finally have answers. Fawn Cox was a student at Northeast High School in Kansas City, Missouri. She was an active member at the Sheffield Assembly of God Church, where she participated in numerous youth activities. In the summer of 1989, the 16-year-old was working as a cashier at Worlds of Fun, a local amusement park. On the night of July 25th, she arrived at her home on East 9th Street after her shift at work, spoke with her parents, and went upstairs to go to sleep around 11 p.m. as she had to be back at work the following morning. The next day, Fawn's alarm sounded as it normally did on days when she had to go to work, but she did not turn it off. Her mother and her younger sister, Felisa, went into her room to see why she was not waking up. Felisa went over to her sister's bed to try to shake her awake, but Fawn did not stir. She was deceased. Fawn's autopsy would later show that she had been raped and strangled. Several small electronic devices were missing from her room, leading police to investigate the possibility that Vaughn had been attacked during a robbery. They believed her killer had entered her second-story bedroom through a window, potentially climbing on top of a truck parked behind the house to reach it. Fawn shared her bedroom with one of her sisters, but had been the only member of her family upstairs on the night of her death. Her parents and sisters had been sleeping downstairs because they had air conditioning units on the main floor. None of them heard any of the noise from the attack during the night, potentially because of the noise generated by the air conditioning units. The only unusual thing they noticed that night was the agitated behavior of the family dog, which they had simply attributed to the fact that she was pregnant at the time. 3 arrests were made in the case within a month of the murder. 2 of the suspects were juveniles. At least one of the suspects remained in jail for 8 months until the case against him fell apart. The witness whose testimony led to the arrests admitted that they had lied to the police and the charges against all 3 suspects were dropped. The killer's DNA was found at the crime scene in semen and in hairs. As technology progressed over the years, the DNA profile from that evidence was able to exclude the 3 original suspects as well as several others. No match to it was ever found in any criminal database. By 2019, as genetic genealogy was solving cases all over the country, The Cox family questioned why the new technology was not being used in Fawn's case. As happy as they were that so many families were finding the answers they had spent 3 decades chasing, they did not see why the same technique could not be used in Fawn's case when a DNA profile was available. The Kansas Police Department had not used genetic genealogy in the case because of a lack of funding. Fawn's family therefore began fundraising to cover the cost, hosting a motorcycle ride, t-shirt sales, auctions, and pool tournaments. However, the police would not accept the funds. According to Sergeant Jake Bikina, the department had to serve everyone equally and could not allow certain cases to receive more advanced tests over other cases based on a family's ability to pay for them. The Cox family argued that the money should be accepted because it wasn't theirs. It had been contributed by the community at large. Kansas City Police began looking into federal grants that could be used to cover the cost. Eventually, the FBI took on the cost of using genetic genealogy in Fawn's case, and in November of 2020, Fawn's murder became the first case in Kansas City solved using genetic genealogy. Fawn's killer was identified as her own cousin, Donald Cox Jr., who had been 21 at the time of Fawn's murder. He had died of an overdose in 2006. His death was ultimately found to not be the result of foul play but had initially been treated as suspicious. The medical examiner had therefore opened an investigation and saved a blood sample from his autopsy. DNA was extracted from that sample to confirm that Donald's DNA was a match to that found at the crime scene. The Cox family's relief at finally having Fawn's killer identified was of course complicated by feelings of betrayal as Fawn had been taken from them by someone within their own family. However, when the Kansas City Police Department notified Fawn's parents of the identification, they did say that they had occasionally suspected their nephew of being involved in the crime over the years. "It's a relief that there's closure," said Felisa Cox after the announcement was made. "The answers aren't always what we were asking for, but there's closure." Siobhan McGinnis was, according to her father, a genius who spoke perfect English by the time she turned 4. She was also a happy and outgoing child who was always smiling. On February 5, 1974, the 5-year-old went to a friend's house to play. She then began the short walk back to her home, less than 3 blocks away, in the north side of Missoula, Montana. She never arrived and was reported missing. A massive search for Siobhan began, utilizing law enforcement, search dogs, and over 100 volunteers. The effort was complicated by heavy snow that fell the day after her disappearance. On February 7th, 2 days after Siobhan went missing, her body was found in a snowy drainage culvert near the Tura exit of Interstate 90, east of Missoula. Her autopsy would reveal that had been sexually assaulted and sustained a head injury and 2 stab wounds to the chest. Police investigated several suspects, including a 15-year-old boy who underwent a lie detector test and questioning under the influence of sodium amytal before being cleared. Police identified a vehicle that was potentially connected to the case, a green Cadillac with New York State license plates, but never located it. Despite an exhaustive investigation involving multiple law enforcement agencies, the case ultimately went cold. Same bowls from Siobhan's rape kit were thankfully properly stored following her murder, and they would provide authorities with the killer's DNA profile once technology advanced to the point where it was possible to extract it. It was run through criminal databases, but no match was ever found. The Missoula City Police, the Missoula County Sheriff's Office, the Missoula County Attorney's Office, the Montana Department of Justice, and the FBI would all contribute to the investigation over the years. In 2019, Missoula Police began working with the Cold Case Squad at the Missoula County Sheriff's Office to explore other ways of using the DNA evidence to solve Siobhan's case. They worked with Othram Incorporated to use genetic genealogy in the case, an effort which eventually led investigators to a potential suspect. That suspect's children were contacted, and they provided DNA samples for comparison, which confirmed that the suspect was DNA from Siobhan's rape kit. On October 26, 2020, more than 46 years after Siobhan's murder, Missoula Police Chief Jason White announced during a virtual press conference that DNA had identified Richard William Davis as a suspect in the case. In addition to the DNA evidence, police learned that Davis had driven a green Cadillac with New York plates in 1974, and photographs of him that time period were consistent with descriptions given by 2 eyewitnesses. Davis could not be arrested, however, because he had died in 2012 at the age of 70 in Cabot, Arkansas, where he had lived since the late 1980s. Davis was a born-again Christian and had worked for years as a truck driver. He was survived by a wife, 4 daughters, 9 grandchildren, and a great-granddaughter upon his death. His family has cooperated with the investigation and reached out to Siobhan's family. During their virtual press conference announcing the resolution of the case, Siobhan's half-sister Una, appearing through a video conference, requested that the public show Davis's widow and daughters the same kindness they have shown her family and respect their privacy during this difficult time. The family of the they did not have to cooperate or care about these things, but they were willing to do this for us, and they have reached out to us. They sent a very lovely in Missoula in 1974 and in Missoula in 1974 and believe he may have just simply been passing through. He lived and worked all across the United States during the 1960s and 70s. He was a missionary on the Sioux Reservation and later a mine worker in South Dakota in the 1960s, a school bus driver in Alaska in the mid-70s, and a security guard at the Arkansas School for the Deaf and Blind in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when he was also a volunteer with Big Brothers Big Sisters. He is also known to have lived in Pennsylvania and New York and to have traveled extensively to numerous other states. While Davis has no known criminal convictions, he had previously been connected to other crimes. After authorities in Missoula notified the Village of Beth Police Department in Beth, New York, of Davis's connection to Streffen's murder, they reopened one of their own cases. 24-year-old Barbara Jean Alexovich disappeared in 1973 when Davis was living in Bath and working at a local dairy. Davis was known to police because of several alleged incidents of attempted child lurings, including an attempted abduction of an 8-year-old girl the same year went missing. Barbara and her husband had been at the local Elks Lodge on the night of October 3, 1973, and she left the establishment to walk the 2 blocks to their home alone. She has never been seen again. Police are asking anyone with information about Davis during his time in Bath or Barbara Alexovich's disappearance to contact them. Shortly after the announcement of the identification of Davis, Siobhan's family announced plans to memorialize her in Missoula. The Zootown Arts Community Center is currently raising funds to create a rooftop garden in Siobhan's memory, which Siobhan's mother hopes will serve as a place that will bring the entire community together. If they are unable to execute the rooftop garden as planned, any funds that are raised will be used to create an alternative memorial. A call is made to 999, reporting a house fire on Georgia Drive in Nottingham, England. 2 young boys have escaped with the family dog as the fire engulfs the building. Emergency services quickly arrive and attempt to extinguish the blaze. As the fire consumes the house and disrupts the peaceful suburban streets, news spreads that a woman has been found dead inside. One neighbor comments, "You see things like that on TV, but when you know the person, you just can't believe it." At about 7:30 that morning, fire investigation dog handler David Cross was paged with the control room saying he needed to attend the nearest police station at around 9 o'clock for a briefing before the fire investigation team went down to the scene, with them arriving at the house at around 11 a.m. The police had cordoned off a large area around the estate, but there was substantial interest from the press. Journalist Rebecca Shirley said that the first the media had heard of the incident was that there had been a fire on Georgia Drive. Many neighbors had come outside and reporters learned from speaking to them that the 2 young boys had managed to escape, but the lady inside had died. From the outside, there was severe smoke damage to the windows. The source of the fire was quickly found. It appeared to be around a body that was lying on the bedroom floor. The task of investigators was to try and work out exactly what had happened. The older of the 2 children who lived at the house, who was just 14 years old, told the detectives a horrifying and disturbing story. He explained that he had woken up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. After exiting his bedroom, he had come face to face with a man in a mask who proceeded to throw a hammer at him before fleeing. He then said that he went into his mother's bedroom that was on fire, where he found that she had been attacked. In a state of panic, he grabbed his little brother before running out of the burning building. As the flames spread through the family home, the children went next door to raise the alarm. He then ran back inside to rescue the pet dog, but he was unable to get to his mother, and she was still inside as the house continued to burn. The badly burned body was recovered and then taken away for a post-mortem. Due to the fire, the body had to be identified using dental records. The victim was discovered to be 47-year-old mother of two, Jacqueline Bartlum, known to most as Jackie. After she had been identified, the next task was to determine how she had died. It quickly became clear to the police that the fire was not an accident. It had been started deliberately to cover up the fact that she had died of blunt force trauma caused by multiple blows to the head. Jackie's partner, Simon Matters, had heard on the news that there had been a fire at a house on Georgia Drive. Upon hearing about the fire, he sent a text message to Jackie's sister, who confirmed that Jackie was missing and that the remains of a body had been found in the fire. He raced back, not knowing the details about what had happened. As the news began to spread about what had happened that night, people began to hear more about the victim of this disturbing attack. Jackie Bartlett was a doting mother of two young boys. In 1996, she had given birth to her first son with her partner Adrienne, and the pair got married 3 years after. They would later have a second son together. They had a stable and comfortable life. They lived in a nice detached house in a middle-class area, and the children attended the local private school. But the happiness was not to last, however, as Jackie and Adrienne's marriage would eventually end in divorce. Following the split, she had moved with her sons to another part of Nottingham. In May 2008, Jackie met Simon Matters on a night out. He didn't go out with the intention of meeting somebody, but he was soon smitten with her. Her loving and caring nature stood out to Simon, and he noted how she showed a genuine interest in people. The pair later became an item. By all accounts, Jackie was a loving woman who didn't have enemies. Nobody could understand why anyone would want to kill her in such a brutal way. Just 2 days after the terrifying house fire, the police announced that they had made an arrest. The full picture of what had happened wouldn't come to light until a name suppression order was lifted, allowing the press to name the alleged killer and give details on what had happened. This had been a meticulously planned and orchestrated murder. It wasn't a stranger who had broken in and savagely killed a woman at random. The killer was a child, Jackie's 14-year-old son, Daniel Bartlett. Daniel was born on the November 11th, 1996, with his little brother being born several years later. When he was just 8 years old, Daniel became obsessed with fictional gore and violence. As he began to retreat further and further into his dark world, he became more reclusive and isolated. He would spend the majority of his time in his bedroom feeding into his obsessions. He would watch his collection of horror films, with movies like Saw and Nightmare on Elm Street being frequently rewatched, as well as playing video games. Just 12 months after becoming obsessed with gore and violence, his life would be turned upside down. His parents' marriage fell apart and the couple would later divorce. Daniel and his brother would go to live with Jackie. Jackie went out of her way to try and minimize the disruption and continued to pay for his private schooling for around 6 months until it was no longer affordable. The divorce, as with many separating couples, had huge financial implications for the family. Due to the financial strain, she had to remove Daniel from his private school and instead send him to the local comprehensive. Forensic psychologist Professor Kevin Brown said that as he had been removed from his private school and sent to a state school, he could have experienced bullying and feelings of ostracization from his classmates, as well as feeling a loss of status. It was also around this time of him changing schools that Simon and Jackie began to discuss moving in together, with them both selling their houses and buying one as a couple. But although they found several houses that they liked, they weren't able to find one that Daniel approved of. It was then too that Daniel's behavior began to change even more, becoming defiant and playing up. Daniel didn't chip in around the house and didn't do chores, with Simon describing him as selfish. Alone and frustrated with things happening that were outside of his control, Daniel began to isolate himself more and shut himself off from the world. Daniel also started to become more and more angry with the lack of attention he was receiving. His mother now had a new partner and things were happening in his life that he couldn't control, all of which was feeding into his rage. He spent most of his time up in his bedroom and nobody knew what he was doing up there. From around the age of 12, he was mending laptops for people, and that's what they assumed he was doing alone upstairs. He also made several YouTube videos. "Hi, this is Daniel. One person who became with Daniel's increasingly odd behavior was Simon. He was concerned that Daniel was too young to be consuming such explicit and adult material at his age. Whenever Jackie attempted to discipline her son, he would often become violent in an attempt to regain control. On more than one occasion, had to intervene to protect Jackie from her young son. Simon described one occasion where Daniel had started shouting at Jackie. He got so close to her face that Simon had to put himself between the two. Daniel proceeded to run upstairs, and for the next 2 minutes, he would kick the banisters, hit the wall, and swear and shout before going into his room and slamming the door shut. Jackie was so shaken and scared by her son's outburst. In 2010, he was reported missing from home by his mother. Frantic with worry, she contacted the police, sparking a huge search to try and find him. He was eventually found at 1 a.m. by officers as he was walking back to the old home his family had shared before the divorce. The police took him back to his mother's house, where she was again back at square one. Jackie continued to bear the brunt of his increasingly worrying behavior. She found a smaller and more affordable house in the Arnold region of Nottingham. In preparation for the move, Simon helped Daniel pack up his old bedroom. He found plastic toy boxes that were full of urine and feces that had clearly been there for some time. He also found dirty towels that Daniel had used to clean himself that he had then hidden under the bed. Simon was horrified and became even more concerned for Daniel. He soon made another disturbing discovery. Hidden in a laptop bag were a load of Jackie's underwear that she had been looking for. Forensic psychologist Professor Kevin Brown has argued that this was not due to a sexual motive, but rather an attempt to gain attention. Daniel's strange behavior was also noted at school. Following an outburst of violence in May 2010, he was referred to the school counselor. After this, concerns would continue to mount. In his counseling sessions, he would speak about hearing voices and how the voices were telling him to hurt people. He discussed visions he was having of killing people and also spoke about how his school tie, that he had called Fred, had a life of its own and was trying to strangle him. He would also spend hours writing stories, with Simon saying some of them focused on children killing each other. He would draw pictures of people stabbing each other, with this taking place around a year and a half before the murder of Jackie. He had gone from consuming violent media to creating and producing it himself. As he moved into his early teens, he continued to feed into his fixation with violence in film. It was also around this time that he began to watch soap operas. Emmerdale and Coronation Streets became ones he especially enjoyed, with one character in particular becoming an obsession for Daniel. The character of John Stape was a regular on Coronation Street, who started in 2007. He quickly became the villain of the show, involved in several major storylines, including kidnap and murder, before being killed off in 2011. One of these storylines involved him battering another character called Charlotte Hoyle with a hammer before leaving her body in the wreckage of a tram crash to cover up his crime. Other stories that Daniel wrote involved him being the most famous soap opera star that had ever lived and had been on a soap for 50 years, highlighting his desire for either fame or infamy. Bartlett immersed himself in his fantasy world to such an extent that the boundaries between real life and fiction would become disturbingly and tragically blurred. By March 2011, just 6 weeks before the murder of Jackie Bartlam, a mental health assessment was carried out at Thornywood Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. Following the assessment, it said that Daniel demonstrated no mental illness, and he was judged as being little or no risk or threat to himself or others. By April 2011, the relationship between Jackie and Daniel had continued to break down and had now reached an all-time low. He was still obsessed with violent media, and much of his anger was fixated on and directed towards his mother. April 25, 2011. Everything appeared normal in the Bartlett household. Simon had been texting Jackie on the Easter Sunday and appeared to be fine with her saying that Daniel had plans to go out with his grandparents. He took the pet dog Meg to get her coat trimmed, mowed his mother's lawn, and ate some Easter eggs. Daniel spent the previous evening re-watching one of the Saw films. In the early hours of 25th, he would set his disturbing plan in motion. It has been reported that he left the house and headed into the garden, where he had hidden a can of petrol and a claw hammer in the shed. After walking back through the garden and into the house, he headed upstairs. After entering his mother's bedroom, He watched her as she slept for a while. He then proceeded to raise the hammer above his head, bringing it down with disturbing force. He struck his sleeping mother 7 times, fracturing both her skull and her face. After rolling her onto the floor, he used scraps of newspaper to surround her body. He then proceeded to douse her in petrol and then started a fire. He ran to his younger brother, waking him up to tell him that the house was ablaze, before running out of the burning building. As he waited on the street for the police to arrive, he began to tell the neighbors that it wasn't long before officers started to question Daniel's version of events. When Simon initially saw the news report, it just said that there had been a house fire in Nottingham. An hour later, it was confirmed that the fire had taken place on Georgia Drive where Jackie had lived. Although it was to be confirmed exactly which house had been caught in the blaze, he said he knew it would be Jackie's, and he knew who would be responsible. Despite the best efforts of Daniel Bartlett to cover up his crime, forensics were able to find many pieces of evidence that pointed the fingers solely in his direction. When the forensics team went into the home to search it, 2 hammers were found. One was a claw hammer, which following an examination was proven to be the murder weapon. The other hammer was a lump hammer that had been planted by Daniel to act as a red herring and throw the investigators off the scent. According to former Detective Chief Inspector Colin Sutton, who worked with the Metropolitan Police Force, the degree of planning that he had exhibited, from planning the murder to setting the fire, using a decoy weapon and adamantly sticking to his story, demonstrated a determination not usually seen in a 14-year-old boy who had committed such a serious offense. When examining his laptop, officers found even more disturbing evidence. Whilst he had deleted it from his computer days before the murder, officers were able to recover a story that Daniel had written. It was a fictional version of himself where he was the central character. In the story, Daniel was a master criminal who got away with a string of gruesome murders, rapes, and assaults. Also in the story, he bludgeoned his mother to death with a hammer before setting fire to the body in order to make it look like an intruder had done it. But as the events of April 25th unfolded in the early morning hours, it proved to be more than a fantasy. This was his plan. Like the version of himself in his story, Daniel pretended to police that the attack had been carried out by an intruder. He wrote, the only place he couldn't get away with his bad deeds was with his mother, Jackie. So, one evening, made it look as though there was a break-in and murdered his mother with a hammer, then set her and the family home alight. After his denial and vehemently sticking to his story, Daniel admitted to killing his mother and proceeded to tell the police an entirely different version of events. On the day of the murder, he said he had argued with his mother, and she had then gone off to bed. He said that at around 1 a.m., he had stormed into her bedroom and they had a blazing row about a pair of trainers that he couldn't find. He said he then returned with a hammer and beat her to death. But the idea that this had been a spur-of-the-moment attack didn't match with what officers had found. His script showed this was not a murder that had come from a fit of rage. This was a planned and thought-out murder that had been meticulously plotted. When trying to ascertain exactly why Daniel had committed the offense, neuroscientist Professor Francesca Happ spoke in a documentary about Daniel's case and noted that people with psychopathic tendencies don't have a break in their behavior that other people would. For example, seeing someone in distress would cause people to stop. And whilst this isn't a motivation to do harm, people with psychopathy don't stop from doing harm. She said that Daniel's case is completely mysterious and seemingly without any motive. She also noted that children and their brains are still developing throughout childhood and adolescence, so determining if a child has psychopathy is incredibly difficult. But it is clear that adults who have many psychopathic traits typically show them when they are much younger. Forensic psychologist Professor Kevin Brown said that what made Daniel so different is in a crime as violent as his, one would expect to see a history of abuse and neglect. But this appeared to be absent in his case. The only thing that appeared to traumatize him was the divorce of his parents. On the October 4th, 2011, Daniel Bartlett lamented a plea of not guilty. He claimed he had been provoked. Before his trial started, Daniel Bartlett was examined by mental health experts for the prosecution and defense, and they agreed that he did not have any psychiatric or psychological condition. January 23, 2012. Daniel Bartlett's trial began, and it was now the job of the Crown Prosecution Service to prove that he had deliberately killed his mother. The case was unprecedented and caused significant media interest. Very few had ever followed a case of such brutality committed by someone so young against a family member. It was also unique due to the levels of planning that Daniel had shown leading up to the murder. Journalist Rebecca Shirley, who was reporting on uncovering the trial, said that when she saw Daniel in the dock, she was surprised at how young he'd looked. She said he didn't look 14 years old. He looked maybe 11 or 12. She also described him sitting meekly in the dark, but when he was cross-examined after giving evidence, he became arrogant and gave as good as he got. He would put his head in his hands frequently, but not seemingly due to remorse or shame as he was peeking through his hands to see who was watching him. Simon Matters, Jackie's partner, believed this was all for show. There were no tears. There was no remorse. It appeared that Daniel was completely disinterested and couldn't be bothered to pay attention. Daniel's barrister had asked if he had planned on killing his mother. Daniel replied, "I didn't plan to kill her at that time." In court, the jury heard that Daniel had immersed himself in a fantasy world and the boundaries between his fictional and real life had become tragically blurred. He told the court, "In the story, I got away with it and I thought I could get away with it in real life." The evidence was overwhelming, so the defense Daniel used was that he had committed the murder after suffering verbal and physical abuse at the hands of his mother. This gave him a defense in law of loss of control, which if proven, would reduce an allegation of murder to manslaughter. But this contradicted what many people knew of his mother. Jackie was known to be a kind-hearted and good-natured woman, and nobody had ever seen her mistreat her children or be abusive. His arrogance seemingly knew no bounds. Towards the end of the trial, he turned towards Simon and ran his finger across his neck in a motion that indicated slitting someone's throat. Simon said he didn't find it intimidating. He said it was just Daniel being Daniel. After a 2-week trial, Daniel Bartlett was unanimously found guilty of murder. When the jury came back with the verdict, Daniel hung his head and looked down towards the floor, appearing as if he was about to cry. Some have speculated that this wasn't due to remorse, but more likely a realization that his life was effectively over. The judge, Mr. Justice Julian Flo, said, "Whilst there clearly were arguments between you and your mother, not untypical between mothers and their teenage children, I am quite satisfied that there was no physical or verbal abuse by your mother such as you alleged in your evidence at trial." The judge also added that it was a grotesque and senseless killing. On the April 2nd, 2012, Daniel Bartlett was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 16 years. He is eligible for release in 2028, but this will not happen if it is deemed that he is still a danger to others. Upon being unanimously convicted and sentenced, Mr. Justice Julian Flo, who had presided over the trial, decided to have the reporting restrictions lifted. The decision in this case to lift the anonymity on Daniel's identity and release his name and details of his crime to the public, despite his young age, allowed for the press to report on exactly what had happened. Detective Chief Inspector Kate Maynall, who had led the investigation, said she had never dealt with such a horrific case. The level of violence, degree of planning, and extent of his lies is not only shocking, but it is also chilling that a boy of 14 could do this. This murder has devastated everyone involved. There is only one person who knows why it happened, and Daniel has lied consistently throughout, making attempts to besmirch Jacqueline's character. Everyone who knew her knew she lived for her children and was a warm and loving mother. Maybe one day, Daniel will tell the truth, as there are several gaps that only he can fill. In a statement released on behalf of the family, Jackie Bartlett's parents said that Daniel's attempts to depict her as a bad mother couldn't be further from the truth. She was, they said, a wonderful, loving, and caring woman who would always be there to help if anyone was in trouble. The statement said that the family was still struggling to come to terms with what Daniel had done. "We find it so hard to explain what we're going through. There are no winners here because not only have we lost Jackie, but we have lost Daniel too because of what he has done. We know it was the right result at court, but trying to understand how a boy you have loved for 14 years can do something like this is so difficult. The most difficult part for us, and something that only Daniel can answer, is why." Simon has said that although he doesn't hate Daniel, he doesn't love him either, saying he has no feelings towards him at all. I believe in forgiveness, but there's some things you can forgive and some things you can't. It was reported recently that Simon had received a letter from the Ministry of Justice telling him that Daniel Bartlett was to have his sentence reviewed as he had moved to an adult prison. The letter read, "This review will look at whether his tariff can be reduced, as the belief is that a youngster has the ability to change more rapidly than adult offenders. You have the right to submit a victim personal statement for the High Court to consider." Simon said he was horrified by the decision. "I'm absolutely and utterly against this. I don't believe that he can be rehabilitated. With what he did and the horrific nature of it, and the way he was so manipulative, my only fear is that he will have manipulated the parole board and pretended he's better. That's my only fear. I don't fear him. The facts of exactly what happened that night may never be fully known, as there is only one person alive who knows the truth. And that is Daniel Bartlett. What we do know is those who knew and loved Jackie are determined that she will be remembered as a loving mother and partner who cared deeply for people, and not by the tragic and appalling way that her life was taken." On March 25, 2020, deputies from the Crittenden County Sheriff's Office responded to a security alarm triggered at the historic Snowden House, a colonial-style mansion on the northwestern shore of Horseshoe Lake near Hughes, Arkansas. Upon arrival, they entered the home through an open back door. While clearing the house, they encountered a man on the second floor. Upon spotting the deputies, the man jumped out of a window. Despite the height of the jump, the deputies observed him running to a nearby vehicle and climbing inside, apparently not seriously injured. He then tried to drive away, but the vehicle became stuck in the mud. The man then ran towards the lake. The deputies watched as he jumped in the fruited water but never saw him come back up to its surface. There was no other living person found in Snowden House, but the deputies did discover the bloody body of Martha McKay, the granddaughter of the builders of the home and its current owner, wrapped in a blanket at the top of the home's grand staircase. She had been stabbed and bludgeoned to death. The Arkansas Game and Fish Commission and the Crittenden County Search and Rescue Team were brought in to recover the body of Martha's presumed killer in the lake. The Game and Fish Commission successfully used sonar to locate it, and Search and Rescue was then able to pull it from the water. After his body was retrieved, Martha McKay's murderer was identified as 39-year-old Travis Sante Lewis. His autopsy found methamphetamine, marijuana, and cocaine in his system. Both and Travis Lewis were not strangers to the home or to Martha's family. 23 years prior to killing Martha, Travis Lewis had killed her mother, Sally Snowden McKay, and her cousin Joseph Lee Baker at a home just down the shoreline from Snowden House after the pair came upon Travis in the process of robbing Sally's home. Snowden House was originally built by Robert Bogartus Snowden II and his wife, Grace Montcastle Snowden. The Snowdens were a prominent family in Memphis, Tennessee, and Robert's father, Robert Brinkley Snowden, was heavily involved in business, banking, and real estate development throughout the greater Mid-South area. The younger Robert became fascinated with airplanes at a young age and eventually became a pilot. In 1916, while flying over eastern Arkansas in a small plane, he first saw Horseshoe Lake and the beautiful land surrounding it, some 30 miles south of Memphis. When he returned home, he told his father that he one day wanted to build a farm there. Robert then went off to serve during World War I. He had already met his future wife, Grace, at a hayride in Knox, Tennessee, where he was attending agricultural school at the University of Tennessee. The couple hoped to marry before Robert left for war, but Grace's mother refused to allow the marriage to occur until Robert returned home. Grace trained to be a nurse in Robert's absence in case he returned home from the war injured. She then went on to be a well-respected nurse for the Red Cross for the remainder of the war. When Robert returned home, his father told him that he had purchased more than 10,000 acres of land in eastern Arkansas from its struggling owner. The elder Snowman allowed his son to purchase 1,000 of those acres near Horseshoe Lake. Grace and Robert married in 1919 and began the process of building a home there. The original Snowden home at Horseshoe Lake was a more modest one-story fishing cabin, propped up on brick supports with a screened-in porch the length of the front of the house. It was not until the 1940s that it was expanded into the large, three-story Snowden house, modeled after colonial-style Bella mansions more commonly found in Louisiana. Robert and Grace had 3 daughters together: Sally, Edie, and Happy. The girls spent their early childhood at the home on Horseshoe Lake, where their father farmed acres of cotton, but were eventually sent to Memphis to live with their grandparents so that they could attend school. They lived on Central Avenue in Ashler Hall, a castle-like home their grandfather had designed and built in 1896. While Sally Snowden spent her school years in Memphis and much of her young adulthood in California, her heart remained at Horseshoe Lake. She eventually married an actor from New York named David McKay, and they moved to San Francisco. By 1976, the couple's children were grown and their marriage was over. Sally moved back to Memphis, where she bought a home in Midtown and opened an office for her work as a certified public accountant. However, she spent as much of her time as possible at her home in Horseshoe Lake, not far from Snowden House. While they were the first people to build a home on the lake, and for a while were the only ones with the residents in the area, over the years a small community had sprung up around the lake, and it was continuing to expand. Sally was in charge of managing the family property in the area. Her father had created a corporation that controlled the properties he owned in the 1960s and divided shares in the company between his daughters and their children. The company controlled the house and its surrounding farmland, as well as a fishing camp, industrial property in Orchard, and 30 lakefront cabins Robert owned. Following his death in 1982, Sally had been put in charge of the corporation. She had divided up ownership of the cabins between her family and the families of her 2 sisters, but everyone remained owners in the rest of the property through their shares in the corporation. By the 1990s, much of the land was leased, including Snowden House itself, which was leased out to a family that ran a bed and breakfast and a restaurant out of it. Sally now had recreational rentals on some of the property that she also managed. She also opened a small antique store, or Shoe Antiques, in the area around this time. Sally was high-spirited and happy. She loved to travel and was always up for an adventure. She was most comfortable in sandals and jeans. She once told her friend, Karen Shea, about an English lord she had met in her youth. He had wanted to marry her. When Karen asked why she hadn't accepted the proposal, Sally replied, "Oh Karen, I just didn't want to get dressed up all the time." Everyone who lived near Horseshoe Lake knew her simply as MS. Sally, even though many of them were her tenants or employees. "I don't care if you're black, white, or whatever. If you was in trouble, if you needed help and went to Miss Sally, you could have got it." Lifelong Horseshoe Lake resident Levi Glasper said about her in 1996. Lee was like that too. He was the same way. Lee was Joseph Lee Baker, Sally Snowden McKay's nephew. Lee was a popular Memphis area blues musician. He played guitar and regularly performed at venues on Memphis's famous Beale Street. He was in several bands over the course of his career, but was mainly playing with his band, The Agitators, by the 1990s. He had collaborated with numerous other artists on their recordings over the years. Lee and his wife Carol lived on a house near Horseshoe Lake with their 3 sons, Joe, Bo, and Ben. On August 12, 1996, the home was tragically lost to a fire, which burned so intensely that it had melted the paint off of one of the fire trucks that had responded to put it out. Authorities were investigating the possibility that the fire had been the result of arson. The Bakers were therefore staying at a lakefront home just 100 yards down the road from Sally Snowden McKay's home. On the morning of September 10, 1996, Carol Baker saw her husband exercising. He gave her a kiss and told her he will be going over to speak with his Aunt Sally about some business. He assisted her with some of the operational aspects of the family's properties. Later that morning, a local man named Bobby Couples came across a bright red Toyota Camry wrecked along the side of the road. The car was on its side, and its engine was still running. Bobby kept driving and stopped at a nearby boat shop to see if anyone there knew whose car it was. Levi Glasper, one of the owners of the shop, came out to see the car and identified it as belonging to Sally Snowden McKay. Levi and Bobby immediately went to Sally's home, roughly a mile away, to check on her. When the 2 men arrived at the home, Lee Baker's white GMC Sierra was backed up against its back door. Levi, a volunteer firefighter, put the back of his hand up against one of the home's windows and could tell by the heat he felt that there was a fire inside of the home. He and Bobby had to drive back to the boat shop to call for help, but then return to the home to try to help Sally and Lee. When the fire trucks arrived, Bobby and Levi had just pulled Lee's truck away from the door using a winch. While the fire was still not visible from outside the home, flames were visible in the kitchen and living room once the door was opened. Firefighters were able to extinguish the fire within a few minutes. While the fire was quickly contained, it had caused devastating damage to the home. However, the physical damage to the property was of little concern compared to what else was found inside of it. Inside the home, firefighters discovered the badly burned bodies of Sally Snowden McKay and Lee Baker. Sally was 75 years old, and Lee was 52. The subsequent investigation would reveal two disturbing details about the fire. It had been set intentionally, and it had not been what killed Sally and Lee. They had both been shot. Following his father's death and August fire, an appeal went out to the Memphis music community, asking for anyone with pictures of Lee to send them to his family. Sally and Lee's murders were the first in the entire history of the Horseshoe Lake community. Their neighbors were in shock and on edge, in disbelief that such a terrible crime could have occurred in their beloved community, but also fearful that the killer might strike again. They luckily did not have to wait very long for the culprit to be brought into custody. On November 5, 1996, less than 2 months after the murders, authorities made an arrest in the case. They arrested and charged Travis Sante Lewis, a 16-year-old sophomore at nearby Hughes High School, with 2 counts of capital murder. His birthday was in October, meaning that he had been just 15 years old at the time of the murders. Travis Lewis did have a minor juvenile record with charges ranging from a curfew violation to aggravated assault. The Horseshoe Lake community was still shocked that he had committed such a heinous crime. He was described as scrawny and quiet, polite and soft-spoken. He was an above-average student at Hughes High School, where Lee Baker's son, Bo, was a year ahead of him. Travis lived with his mother, Gladys, and his younger siblings in a woodhouse across a bean field from Sally Snowden McKay's home. His grandparents, who rented from Sally, lived next door. Travis's first court hearing the day after his arrest provided little insight into how he came to be arrested. Deputy Prosecuting Attorney Lindsay Fairley told Circuit Judge Sam Turner Jr. that police had evidence tying him to the scene. He subsequently was interviewed and has made a statement and confirms his presence at the scene, but that possible additional defendants and the possibility of additional charges prevented him from providing further information about the investigation. Crittenden County Public Defender Tom Montgomery, who was representing Travis Lewis, argued that the prosecution had not presented sufficient evidence to hold his client and that he should be released while awaiting trial. Judge Turner disagreed, and Travis was held without bond. The exact evidence that police used to identify Travis Lewis as their suspect was not made public because the case was settled before the evidence was presented at trial. The trial was set to begin on April 7, 1998, but that morning, Travis instead pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, burglary, and theft. The 17-year-old was sentenced as an adult to 28.5 years in prison on the murder charges and to 5 years in prison for the lesser charges. The sentences would all run concurrently. Based on what we know and the evidence that we were aware of, the family felt like this was the best resolution. Sally's niece, Dottie Jones, told the Commercial Appeal after the sentencing. The Snowden family had opposed the possible imposition of the death penalty in the case had Travis been convicted of capital murder. However, when the family was notified each time Travis Lewis became eligible for parole, every member of the family was opposed to him being released every time. There was only one family member who disagreed with this position: Sally's daughter, Martha McKay. Martha shared her mother's love of adventure, and her kind heart and generous spirit endeared her to everyone she met. Following her mother's death, her aunt, Edie Dewey, took over management of the family corporation, and Martha returned to Memphis from the West Coast for several months to help her aunt during the stressful transition phase as she adjusted to her new responsibilities. Martha also helped with minor improvements at Snowden House after the bed and breakfast closed down. Martha had previously restored a few properties in Seattle, and after her time assisting her aunt came to a close, she began a new, larger project. She purchased a historic home, built in 1861 in Virginia City, Nevada, and renovated and restored it. So, Historic preservation to restore her family's home at Horseshoe with historic preservation to restore her family's home at Horseshoe Lake. While she and her siblings were not raised in the area, they spent all of their summers with their grandparents at Snowden House, and Martha had loved the time she had spent there. By this time, Snowden House was in poor shape. Martha bought it from the family corporation, becoming its sole owner. She then spent several years restoring the property, updating it while still keeping as many of the fixtures and features as historically accurate as possible. Martha had a serious interest in sustainability, so a major project she undertook during the renovation was figuring out a way to make the home more eco-friendly and cost-efficient. Using the ancient furnace to heat the house was a $1,000 a month expense. She eventually put in a geothermal system that used water from the lake to regulate the temperature in the house. Martha's initial plan when she bought Snowden House was to use it as her personal residence and also rent it out as an event venue. However, by the time the extensive restoration on the home was complete, the country was in the middle of a recession, and Martha lost her confidence in her business plan. She put the property up for sale, but could not find a buyer. Martha's inability to sell the house ended up being beneficial for her as she was able to return to her original plan for the house as the economy improved. She turned the home into a successful venue for weddings and other private events and also began renting out one of the home's bedrooms on Airbnb. Martha was a longtime Buddhist, and while she was devastated the deaths of her mother and cousin, she felt it was important to try to forgive their killer. She also felt sympathy for him because he had been just 15 years old at the time of the murders. After Travis pleaded guilty to the murders, Martha reached out to him in prison. Martha's communications with Travis were also influenced by the fact that she did not necessarily believe that Travis had acted alone, and she hoped to find out any further truth about what had happened to her mother and cousin. Travis had confessed to being at Sally's home at the time she and Lee were murdered, and that he and another man had been in the process of robbing it when they were discovered by Sally and Lee. However, he maintained that this other man had actually killed them, even after he pleaded guilty. Based on Lindsay Fairley's statements at the initial hearing, it does appear as though authorities were investigating someone else based on Travis's initial statements to them and believed that they might be making another arrest in the case. However, they appear to have not found evidence supporting Travis's claims of the involvement of this other person in the crime, as no other arrest was ever made. The man Travis claimed was the actual killer was found to have a solid alibi for the time of the crime. Martha, seemingly unable to believe that a 15-year-old could have perpetrated such a violent crime on his own, pressured the police to continue investigating the case, believing that there was more to the story and more people who needed to be brought to justice in the case. Martha's entire family did not support communications with Travis and told her that they believed that nothing good would come of them. Despite the objections of her relatives, Martha visited Travis in prison, wrote him letters, and supported him being released on parole. I think that she really felt in her heart he deserved to be rehabilitated, which I think really speaks to her character after such a tragic event happened to such a close family member. Lee's son Joe Baker is said following Martha's murder, "I'm beyond sad that it turned out this way for her." Travis was released on parole in 2018, 20 years after he pleaded guilty, and Martha continued to help with his rehabilitation. Seemingly without the knowledge of her family, Martha gave Travis a job doing odd jobs at Snowden House following his release. He lived and worked on the property with his mother, Gladys, whom Martha had employed as a housekeeper at the property for several years. Eventually, even Gladys told Martha to give up on her son, warning her to distance herself from Travis because he was reverting back to his old ways. While Martha gave Travis so much in terms of forgiveness and empathy, she finally reached her limit of how much grace she could extend to him a month before he killed her. Martha fired Travis and banned Travis from her property and detailed the incident that led to her decision to do so in her. Martha had sold an antique chandelier for $10,000 and her buyer had paid for it in cash. Travis was present at Snowden House when Martha arrived home to stash the money before depositing it. The money then disappeared. Martha fired Travis and banned him from her property, believing he had been the one who had stolen the cash. Martha's case is closed, and her killer cannot be prosecuted because of his death. While the case is as resolved as it will ever be, there are still lingering questions. Police found a bag containing some of Martha's valuables and a bloody knife near her body. It is unclear if Martha was killed after walking in on Travis robbing her home, like her mother and cousin had been years earlier, or if Travis had come to the home to kill Martha and then decided to rob it after she was dead. The former scenario may be slightly more plausible, as Martha had the chance to set off her alarm, which would have been easier to do when she first walked into her home and saw Travis there, and more difficult to do if he had attacked her as soon as he was able to make his way into the house. Again, there is no way to be sure. What exactly transpired inside of Snowden House on March 25th, 2020 will never be known beyond its terrible end result. What we do know, however, in the words of Martha's sister, Katie Hutton, is that Martha didn't deserve to be killed. She didn't deserve anything that happened to her. Beryl Atherton, originally from Stafford, Connecticut, spent much of her youth in Springfield, Massachusetts. In 1924, she relocated to Marblehead, Massachusetts with her father, Reverend Warren L. Atherton, who had been appointed pastor of the First Baptist Church there. They lived on Waldron Street. Reverend Atherton retired in 1931 due to health issues and passed away in October 1937 at the age of 71. Beryl found his body in a chair in their living room when she returned home from work. After her father's death, Beryl purchased a modest clapboard cottage at 57 Sewell Street in the Reeds Hill section of Marblehead. Beryl had lost her mother before she was even a teenager and had no siblings. In 1950, the 47-year-old, who had never married, shared the home on Sewell Street with a pet cat and a white Spitz named Esky. Beryl was a teacher at the Glover School, where she had been employed for 25 years. Her students would tell their teachers in the higher grades of how much they liked Miss Atherton even years after they were in her class. According to her lawyer and longtime friend, William Lakey, she was plain-spoken and democratic. She was perfectly good in every way. Over Thanksgiving weekend of 1950, a nor'easter came through town, bringing heavy rain and powerful winds to Marblehead. Beryl ventured out of her home on Saturday before the storm hit at full force, first traveling to Salem, Massachusetts to retrieve her fur coat from storage at the cleaners. Back in Marblehead, she went grocery shopping, purchasing beef, a chicken, pork chops, carrots, tea, butter, a bag of donuts, bread, and a newspaper. She was seen leaving around 6 p.m. as the weather continued to grow worse. It would only have taken Beryl approximately 15 minutes to drive home. Around this time, a local paper boy saw her taking out some trash. He would be the last known person to see Beryl alive. After taking out the trash, Beryl appears to have gone upstairs to up her blue suit jacket and change out of her suede shoes in favor of a pair of loafers. She hung her blue skirt over the upstairs outside of her bedroom, presumably to let it dry, as it had almost certainly gotten wet from the increasingly strong rain. No one saw Beryl the next day, which was not unusual. Despite being a pastor's daughter, Beryl never left her home on Sundays for any reason. A neighbor would leave a newspaper at her door because she would not even leave to get one for herself. On the morning of Monday, November 27, 1950, milkman Kenneth Phillips was making his normal rounds. It was his routine to enter Beryl's house by the side door and place her milk in the refrigerator for her as she left home to get to school before he reached her house on his route around 8 a.m. When he looked into the kitchen that morning, however, he saw Beryl there, lying on the floor in a pool of blood. Kenneth ran across the street to get help from one of Beryl's neighbors. Walter Chapman, a retired building custodian, came back to Beryl's home with Kenneth and then called police. There had not been a murder in Marblehead 1885. A sense of panic spread through town with the news of the gruesome crime. In the following days, the police department was inundated with calls from women who thought someone was prowling outside their home and requests for police escorts. There were public calls for more streetlights to be installed in town and for more police officers to be hired. The police department suspended time off for all of its officers who were to focus on the extensive investigation into the case. The most obvious injuries Farrell sustained were the 6 deep cuts to her neck, which were the source of the large pool of blood she was found in. She had lost so much blood that it was difficult for the medical examiner to obtain a blood sample from the body during the autopsy. Initial reports stated a cross had been formed by the cuts to Beryl's neck, raising concerns that there had been some sort of ritualistic nature to the murder. However, police later stated that her wounds were too extensive to tell if there had been any attempt by her killer to create such a shape. According to Essex County Medical Examiner Robert Shaughnessy, the wounds were deep enough that any one of them would have been fatal on its own. However, prior to the cuts being inflicted to her neck, Beryl was strangled. Her hyoid bone was broken, and there were marks on the back of her neck, potentially from her killer's fingernails. Beryl also sustained 3 broken ribs. Beryl was found wearing a sweater and her slip, and while the fact that she was not wearing a skirt or pants seems to point to a sexual assault, the location of the skirt Beryl had been seen wearing while shopping indicated that she had taken it off herself to let it dry. The autopsy found no physical evidence of any kind of sexual assault. However, the fact that Beryl had just been wearing her slip also told police that she most likely had not let her killer into the house, as she would not have answered the door while only being half-dressed. Medical examiner Robert Chauncey stated that whoever killed Beryl had possessed unusual strength in order to have inflicted the injuries he found during the autopsy. However, he did not believe that this meant the murderer had to be a man, stating that a strong woman also could have been the killer. The medical examiner's initial estimate placed Beryl's time of death at some time before midnight on Saturday, the day of the nor'easter. This would seem like a logical time, as the gusting wind would have covered up the sounds of Beryl screaming or Esky barking at an intruder, and the killer could have escaped without being seen, both because it was dark and because no one wanted to be outside in the storm. Both of Beryl's pets were found inside of the home after the discovery, so Beryl's killer could have snuck up on her in the dark, and she would have had no way of calling for help, even if she had been able to fight her way to the phone. However, those final circumstances were most likely not factors in the crime. After further examination of Beryl's body, the medical examiner refined his estimate for Beryl's time of death to be around 7 p.m., which was also more consistent with other evidence at the scene. When police arrived on the scene, the chicken and the pork chops Beryl had purchased on Saturday evening were in the refrigerator, but all of the other groceries she had purchased, including the perishable ones, were still left inside the brown paper grocery bag. It was raining enough by 6 p.m. that it is plausible that her skirt was damp enough that Beryl could have felt the need to take it off midway through putting away her groceries, before taking the time to finish putting away the rest of her perishables. Furthermore, Beryl's autopsy showed that she had not eaten in some time, meaning she did not have dinner that evening. These circumstances and the medical examiner's estimation meant that Beryl was killed shortly after she arrived home, but not immediately. She had time to take out the trash, put away a few groceries, and go upstairs to remove her wet jacket, skirt, and shoes. The killer could have entered the house while she was out running her errands and waited for her, or could have entered the home after she went upstairs and attacked her immediately. The lights had not begun flickering in Marblehead until around 7 and did not go out completely until later in the evening, meaning they most likely were on when Beryl was killed. However, there was evidence that the killer had cleaned up following the murder. A damp rag was found in the kitchen sink, and there was no blood on the refrigerator or cabinets, and police found no fingerprints. By the time the killer left the house after cleaning up, the power may have been out, making it easier for them to escape unnoticed, as there would have been no light from streetlights or coming from neighboring homes. Beryl's glasses and her pearl choker, broken presumably during the attack on her, were found on the floor near her kitchen sink. It appeared her killer had grabbed Beryl while she was near the sink, spun her around, and threw her to the ground. Beryl's physical condition would not have allowed her to put up much of a fight against her killer. She was 5 feet 7 inches tall, but barely weighed 100 pounds. She was frequently referred to as frail and reportedly suffered from a spinal condition. A broken knife was found in the kitchen with 3 of its pieces on the floor, and its handle, with a small piece of the blade still attached to it, was found in a drawer. There was no blood on any of the pieces, but they were all sent to the lab for examination. The knife was ultimately found to not be the murder weapon. The police thought of ways for the concerned citizens of Marblehead to help with their investigation. They asked medical professionals to report any patients who presented with cuts, as Beryl's killer may have injured themselves during the murder. Dry cleaners were asked to turn over any garments brought to them with stains on them that could be blood. Several garments were turned over to police, but the suspicious stains turned out to be from wax and not blood. Several days' worth of trash that had been collected to be sent to the dump was sifted through looking for clues. Again, some items with suspicious stains were found, but none of the stains were from blood. Police interviewed over 100 people about the case in just the first few days of the investigation. In addition to standard interviews with Beryl's neighbors and co-workers, police also spoke with neighborhood troublemakers reported to them by Beryl's neighbors, former mental patients, troubled teenagers, and individuals with criminal backgrounds. None of them could be tied to the crime. Despite the massive investigation, police could not find strong enough evidence to make an arrest or elicit a confession, so they had to investigate potential motives for the murder to try to identify their suspect. They looked into the possibility that there was a financial motive for the murder. Beryl only received a modest salary as a teacher but was more financially secure than her income alone would indicate. Beryl owned her home outright, and while she had only received a small inheritance after her father's death, the funds had reportedly been invested very well, and she earned an income from her stocks. Her entire estate was estimated by her lawyer to be worth around $25,000, which would be equal to more than $270,000 today. Beryl had gone to a bank in Salem, Massachusetts to access her safe deposit box after school on the Friday of the week before Thanksgiving. Police had the box opened in case it held any evidence of a motive for Beryl's murder, financial or otherwise. However, the only items in the box were papers relating to Beryl's father's life and religious works. After going to the bank, Beryl had gone shopping in Boston with one of her friends, Georgiana Henderson. According to Beryl, had been in excellent spirits during their shopping trip after her visit to the bank. Beryl had visited other banks in Boston and in Salem recently, but police did not believe that these visits were significant. According to Beryl's friends, she had recently seen a report that the state was planning to seize stagnant accounts, potentially causing her to check in with previous financial institutions used by herself and her father, as her only open account was found to be at the same bank where she kept her safe deposit box. Beryl had recently discussed drafting a will with her lawyer, William Lakey, but he did not believe this was an indication that she felt she had a reason to fear for her life. Rather, she was simply trying to get her finances in order and make arrangements for the care of her Spitz, Esky. According to Lakey, Beryl had no relatives who expected to profit from her estate and would have been upset over her making a provision for the care of her dog in her will. Her closest living relatives were her uncle, who still lived in Springfield, and first cousin, Polly Merrill Apperson, a physical education teacher in Norwalk, Connecticut. Following Beryl's murder, Polly took on the responsibility of planning her services and burial. Beryl's funeral was held on November 30th. All of Marblehead schools closed early that day so that Beryl's fellow teachers could attend the service. It is believed that most of the town's 105 teachers went to the funeral to honor their fellow educator. Beryl was subsequently buried at her family plot in the Oak Grove Cemetery in Springfield. There was one aspect of Beryl's financial situation that remains shrouded in mystery, and therefore could in theory have something to do with her murder. Beryl maintained detailed financial records. Police found that for more than 2 years, Beryl had written weekly checks to the same individual. The amounts of the checks ranged from $7 to $10, or the equivalent of $75 and $108 today. Beryl's check stubs noted only the amount of each check in the first name of the payee. However, the name was one that could be used by either a man or a woman. The canceled checks for these payments were not found with Beryl's other canceled checks returned to her by her bank, so police could find no other evidence about who Beryl was writing the checks to or why. Beryl had stopped writing these checks at the beginning of November of 1950, just weeks prior to her murder. The cessation of these payments could be a potential motive for the person who had been receiving them to kill Beryl. Police also considered the possibility that Beryl could have been killed by a burglar who had broken into her home. Both the front and side doors to the home were found unlocked. The side door being unsecured could be explained by the fact that its latch was broken, but police believed the fact the front door was unlocked as well pointed to as a motive in the crime, as a burglar would have made sure both the doors were unlocked before beginning to rob the home so as to have 2 ways to quickly escape should someone else come into the house and discover them. However, Beryl's silver collection, on display in a cabinet and valued at $1,000, was left untouched, and police could not identify any items or money missing from the home, meaning that she was most likely not killed by a run-of-the-mill burglar. Police did find a blood stain on a pillow upstairs, an indication that someone had been looking for something. Someone may have come into the house that night to take something, but it was not necessarily for monetary gain. If they found what they were looking for and took it with them, it appears to have an item that was valuable to them specifically. According to some of Beryl's neighbors, she had essentially become a recluse following her father's death. However, it soon became clear that they had assumed Beryl had no life outside of teaching because they knew nothing about her life outside of teaching. Beryl did have several friends, although many of them were fellow teachers, including Georgiana Henderson, the friend Beryl had gone shopping with in Boston just over a week before her death. Beryl regularly went out to dinner with another female friend and was close enough with another to have been invited to her home for Thanksgiving dinner just days before her death. In addition to her active social life with her friends, Beryl was also found to have an active dating life. Beryl had never married, but according to her lawyer, William Lakey, she had fallen in love with a businessman several years before her murder, just prior to the announcement of the couple's engagement. However, he met a woman from Maine he found more attractive. Beryl was of course heartbroken at the end of the relationship, but her spirits improved after a few months. Beryl's former fiancé was investigated but had an alibi for the time of the murder. During the course of their investigation, police had broadcast Beryl's picture and details about her murder across New England on television. According to newspaper reports at the time, this was the first time television had been used by the police to ask the public information about a crime. Police were flooded with calls after the television broadcast, and while almost all of them did not provide any useful information, one of them did open up a major avenue of inquiry. After seeing the broadcast, an accountant from the nearby town of Lynn contacted police. He informed them that Beryl had a very active social life in his town, spending a great deal of time in nightclubs there. According to the accountant, he had seen Beryl off and on from 1946 until 1949. They had not been in a relationship or had strong feelings for each other. He was also able to provide the names of two other men Beryl had casually spent time with. Each of the men reported having a similar relationship with Beryl, enjoying going out on a date with her every now and then, but not being emotionally invested in their relationship. None of the three men were married, and there were no other factors police could find that would make Beryl's association with them anything but innocent. All three men were investigated, but police eventually determined that they were not involved with Beryl's murder. However, while these three men were not believed to be Beryl's killer, it remains possible that some other man Beryl was casually seeing was. While police identified potential motives in Beryl's murder, they all remain just theories. The exact motive for the crime has never been identified, as its perpetrator remains unidentified as well. The case has remained a topic of interest for many in Marblehead, but this interest so far has not brought resolution to the case. While the case consumed the town of Marblehead in 1950 and its police department carried out a thorough and in many ways innovative investigation, Beryl Atherton's murder remains unsolved. Nova Welsh was born in Jamaica in 1957 and relocated to the United Kingdom with her family at the age of 10. Known for her constant smile and laughter, she was cherished by everyone in her community. At just 16, she left home to live with her boyfriend, Osmond Bell, and the couple eventually had 2 sons. However, by the summer of 1981, their tumultuous and abusive relationship was deteriorating. Nova had confided in her sister, Valerie, that Osmond hit her and threatened to kill her should she try to leave him. Neighbors reported that the couple argued near constantly, raising their voices to the point where they could be heard clearly in other apartments in the building. The relationship finally ended after a particularly violent incident in June. Nova's stepsister, Sonia, heard screaming coming from the couple's kitchen in their apartment in Laythorne Avenue, Ladywood, Birmingham. When she ran into the kitchen, she saw Osmond with a dish towel wrapped around his hands. Sonia wanted to call the police, but Osmond ordered her not to. Police did report to the scene, and Nova told them that she and Osmond had been arguing. She had unsuccessfully tried to get him to leave the apartment when the situation escalated. Nova declined to file a report about the incident, and Oswald did leave the home. He moved out a short time later, going to live in Regent Road, Handsworth. She did not discuss the details of the incident with the authorities. Nova did share them with her friends. She told several of them that Osmond had tried to strangle her and showed them the marks on her neck that the attack had left. Osmond was not happy about the end of his relationship with Nova and sent her letters threatening to kill her if she did not get back together with him, telling her that if he could not have her, then no one else could either. According to a friend who had seen one of these letters, Osmond had written Nova that, "If you don't have me back, then you know what I will have to do." On July 25, 1981, Nova dropped off her two sons, ages 26, with Osmond. That evening, she went out to a party with a man she had recently begun seeing and a group of friends. Throughout the following morning-afternoon, neighbors could hear Nova crying and arguing with someone. The last sighting of her was around 6 o'clock that evening when a neighbor reported seeing her, looking upset. Nova never returned to pick up her sons and failed to show up to her job as a cleaner on Monday morning, July 27th. Nova's mother and some other family members had just moved to Miami and were hoping that now that Nova's relationship with Osmond was over, she would decide to join them in America with her two sons. 3 days after they arrived in Florida, they attempted to call to let her know that they had safely arrived. She did not answer the phone, and they could not reach her despite numerous further phone calls. One of Nova's closest friends was Lorna Edmonds. Lorna was also one of Nova's neighbors and sometimes helped her by watching her two children. Lorna had not seen Nova since July 22nd, when Nova had told her that she would not need her help to watch the boys that night because they would be going to see their father instead. Lorna became concerned about Nova when her own phone calls to her went unanswered. She was also worried because Nova's laundry remained up on the line outside. She reported Nova missing to police on August 9th. A massive effort was launched to try to locate the missing woman. Posters were put up around Birmingham. Authorities went door to door visiting over 500 residences by the end of the month, and the case was featured in the local media. One article in the Evening Mail featured photos of and quotes from Nova's two young sons asking for their mother to come home. Osmond Bell was an obvious suspect in Nova's disappearance to her loved ones, given his history of violence towards her in the past. Furthermore, he had never reported Nova missing, even though she had never returned for her sons, and was by all accounts a loving mother who doted on her children. He told police he had assumed Nova had run off with her new boyfriend or left for America to see her family in Florida. On August 12th, an anonymous letter was delivered to Lorna Edmonds that appeared to divert suspicion away from Osmond. The unsigned letter appeared to be written from the perspective of a woman. In it, the writer claimed her boyfriend had seen another man grab and hit Nova through her kitchen window on Sunday, July 26th. The letter writer further stated that her boyfriend had identified the man he had seen as the man Nova had been dating. He was able to make this identification because he had been at the same party Nova and her new boyfriend had attended on July 25th and had seen them there together. At an inquest into the case in December of 1982, it was revealed that police theorized that the letter was written either by Nova's killer or at the killer's behest to throw suspicion onto Nova's new boyfriend. On 18th, residents of the tower block where Nova lived began complaining about a foul odor coming from a utility cupboard under the stairs in the basement. When the cupboard was opened, the body of 24-year-old Nova was found inside of it. She was wearing her night clothes and was covered with a blanket and some papers. Authorities believed that she had been killed in her apartment. Her body was wrapped in the blanket and taken down to the cupboard 2 flights below. The investigation into Nova's murder was initially delayed by several days due to problems with the handling of her initial post-mortem examination. Her second post-mortem examination would show that she had been killed as a result of pressure to the neck. Authorities believed, based on the condition of Nova's body and witness reports, that she had most likely been killed in the early morning hours of July 27th, meaning she had been dead the entire time she had been missing and that her body had remained hidden for 3 weeks. Osmond Bell was taken into custody so that he could be questioned for 4 days, but he was ultimately released due to a lack of evidence. It would be more than 3 decades before Nova's case would be solved using technology that had not been available to investigators in 1981. In 2014, as part of a cold case inquiry, several items of evidence in the case were re-examined in hopes of finding DNA on them. DNA was found on 2 important pieces of evidence. On the seal of the envelope the anonymous letter sent to Lorna Edmonds had been mailed in. on the strip of adhesive where the sender had presumably licked the envelope to seal it, and in piece of chewing gum used to secure the lock on the door to the cupboard where Nova's body had been found. The DNA profile extracted from the gum was complete, but the profile from the envelope was incomplete, providing only 17 points of comparison instead of the normally accepted 20. Both the incomplete sample from the envelope and the complete sample from the chewing gum were a match to Osmond Bell's DNA. The then 59-year-old was arrested and charged with Nova's murder in August of 2016. At his trial in February of 2017, Osmond Beale told the court that he had been abused by police officers during his interrogation following the discovery of Noah's body, and that they had hit him over the head and kicked his chair out from under him. He said his DNA was on the envelope because he had been left alone in the interrogation room with the letter and envelope during his questioning. He said he picked up the letter to read it because he assumed he was being watched and the police would not come back into the room until they saw him read the letter. He explained the presence of his DNA on the chewing gum found in the lock by claiming he, his brother, and his business partner had previously been in the cupboard trying to access a pipe. As a part of the washing machine repair business, they ran out of a nearby garage. They had forced the door open, and he had used his gum to repair the lock to keep the door closed at this time, not at the time of Nova's murder. The jury deliberated for 6 days at the end of the 6-week-long trial before reaching a verdict in the case. They acquitted Osmond Bell on the murder charge but found him guilty of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 12 years but would only be incarcerated for sex, as he would be allowed to serve half of his sentence out on license. When sentencing Bell, Judge Patrick Thomas told him he saw no evidence that he had premeditated killing Nova, and he believed the crime had occurred following an argument, most likely the result of Bell's jealousy over Nova taking advantage of her newfound freedom by socializing. Then said the judge, having killed her, you concealed her body, doing nothing to assuage the pain and grief of your own children. Lorna Welsh released a statement through the police following the conviction. Finally, after 36 long years, Nova can rest in peace, it read. The family can now have closure knowing the person who took Nova's life has been brought to justice. I would sincerely like to thank everyone involved in bringing this case to court. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.